So if we can start, I mean, digital transformation is not a new phrase. Everyone talks about it. It's maybe one of those phrases which is or isn't helpful. It, it means different things to different people. I suppose the first question is, do you think it is a helpful sort of objective for people? And if not, is there a better way of understanding what companies need to be doing? I guess they were already starting pre-pandemic, but the pandemic has maybe accelerated the need to do things differently. If that's not too long a question, there we go.
Yeah, I think digital transformation, it can be useful. It's just been used. It's such an abused phrase at this point that it's lost a lot of its meaning. I think the best way of thinking about it is just pairing it right back to business capabilities. The bigger the business and the more complicated the problem, the harder it is to understand. I had a really interesting chat just last week with someone who owns a small carpentry company, who was saying, it's getting harder and harder to even make a margin on these jobs fitting, custom cabinetry. And we started chatting, and we started talking about how in the last 2 or 3 years, suddenly, his competitors are modeling their products with CAD, and they're using factories to get the stuff pre-cut, and their workers are essentially almost assembling things like IKEA. And this is a tiny carpentry company, which is ultimately saying we need to transform digitally to be able to compete at fitting cabinetry into people's homes. And when you think about it like that, it's the need to adapt and get those new capabilities into a business, really, to just keep up with pace. I think what a lot of businesses, especially larger businesses, when they talk about digital transformation, they say they're doing it, but what they're really doing is modernization. They're not really fundamentally changing their capabilities with technology. They're just using technology to try and gain little efficiencies in the existing ways they're doing things, which isn't really transformation. So I think it's a difficult thing to understand as a business. And I think the pandemic's really interesting because to me, the term post-pandemic is just like a proxy for market change. It's just the velocity of market change increasing. A few years ago, my business was fully remote, and you would always tell people about that, and they would just look at you quizzically, and you would have a lot of interesting questions, and no one would really understand how you could run a business remotely. And then that doesn't happen anymore. It was like in a year, everything changed, and that's just the velocity of change accelerating. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more people talking about digital transformation, but to me, I just always think about new capabilities.
And just to that point, so I'm guessing if people are using sort of technology to improve their existing processes, I mean, that's not bad, but it's only a part of what they could be doing. As you say, the fundamental thing is to understand how technology can, well, use the word transform, but you can do completely new things in completely new ways, and therefore, add completely new strands to a business. That's the real objective, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's only a part of a bigger picture. I don't think that technology is the answer. Technology is just a tool. It will be out of date in a few years. It's about creating alignment and understanding about the continuous role technology needs to play for you to stay competitive. It's here to stay. Like eventually every organization on earth will primarily be software and data-driven entities. It's almost inevitable. That might be a very long timeline, but it's slowly rolling towards us. So, yeah.
No, that's fine. And in terms of the focus, the pandemic perhaps emphasized the fact, I'm not saying it was exclusive before that, but there was a lot of focus on the customer experience, which is clearly very important. But the pandemic seemed to highlight the fact that obviously the employees, if they were all working remotely and they had lousy internet connection, that was a major obstacle to the company, performing proper function. So am I right to think people do need to understand that it's almost, well, it is equally important that their employees are being enabled by this new approach, as well as the importance of the customer?
I think it goes even wider than that. I think it's an old concept, but I think stakeholders is the best way of thinking about it. I think we're moving towards a world where sort of triple bottom line is increasingly more important. It's social, it's environmental, and financial. Your customers are always going to be one of your largest stakeholders, and employees are always going to be one of your largest stakeholders as well. But you can't always be just thinking about just focusing on your customers. Cheaper, faster, easier increasingly comes at a higher cost elsewhere. You see a lot of talk in the media about companies like Amazon as a good example, where there may be a company which in some respects are doing things very much in the right way, but you look at their warehouses and you have to question, but what's the cost of putting the customer first almost, to the nth degree? Is it really worth it? I don't know, but I think thinking more broadly about stakeholders is probably the most important thing in these kinds of transformational plans. And I think that's why capabilities are a good inception point, because a capability is the ability to do something of value, and value equivocally is not just a way of making money. Money is an outcome of creating value for people. And those people are not just your customers, they're also your own employees, they're also your own people, they're also they're also your shareholders, there are all kinds of interest groups around your business. And value creation is just what pushes everything forwards. It's what creates everything from hospitals to warehouses to heating your house. If you focus on building really meaningful capabilities, you focus on how to offer value in the most competitive manner. And what you mentioned there about things like businesses suddenly realizing that they didn't necessarily have the capability to move their workforce to operate from home, it's a great example of a capability gap. We're going to use technology to solve that capability gap, but suddenly a business realizes, hey, we can actually offer this service much cheaper, more efficiently, and in a more economically sustainable way than we could before, when everyone had to commute, drive, and come into an office, and we had to have all this infrastructure and everything. That really is it totally necessary? It's certainly necessary in some respects, but do we need as much of it as we thought? Probably not.
Okay, and at Ascent, you discuss or put forward the idea of building digital muscle, I think is your sort of phrase. And in terms of how that breaks down, if I got it right, it's users, data, software, and platforms. So the connections between so perhaps can you outline that or sort of flesh out that approach?
Yeah. So I think a few years ago, people, the terms of things like big data became popular, and people talked about, software changing the world. And more and more, it's becoming a kind of an integrated ecosystem. Software is transactional. Software is everywhere. There's so much software in the world. It's everything we touch these days, almost in some way, has its roots in software. And software is transactional. Its output is data. So we have huge amounts of data. Every business has huge amounts of data, whether they know it or not. But data is quite frankly, it's useless. It's like a barrel of a crude ingredient. If someone gave me a barrel of crude oil, on paper it's worth $70, but to me personally, it's worth nothing, because I don't have the machinery or chemicals or anything to turn crude oil into anything of any value for me. In a similar fashion, data needs to be transformed. It needs to be turned into information, and then that information, in turn, it needs to be surfaced. It needs to be understood. It needs to be acted upon, and all of those steps. Right from transactional software system through to transforming data, surfacing data, understanding it, acting on data. They're all things that form a kind of an integrated flow inside an organization, inside a business, and that's what we do, and that's where things like platform and data and software all hang together. So, when you transform data, we start talking about things like data warehousing, data lakes. We start talking about, what shape is your data? Is it complete? Do you trust it? Is it, how future-proof is it? When you start thinking about platform, it's about surfacing data. Data's all very well, unless it's in a silo and the people who need it, it's the old story of, the person in accounting who needs the data doesn't even know the data exists because someone in another department elsewhere has it in a spreadsheet. It's you need to surface it, and that's where platform adds a huge amount of value, especially to cloud, because it's so easy to create touch points into that data. And then, understanding, what's the outcomes that's driving? Are you looking back at historic data? Are you looking forwards? Is that forward-looking indicative? Is it predictive? How are you using that data? How are you acting upon it? Is it going into a report? What's the what's the ultimate goal? And then when you have that information, how do you drive change with it? How do you make decisions? How does your business react? How quick is that? It could be, in some examples, almost a closed loop where you drive outcomes back into software systems very rapidly. IoT is a good example of that. Industry 4.0 factory floors which respond dynamically to change and become more efficient through things like that. Or it could be as simple as better board reports, which allow boards to do much longer, much more accurate or much more informed strategic planning into the future.
And just, do you think there's a danger, or there's certainly in the early days, all this talk of big data, there's a danger of people are slightly overselling it? Because, as you say, to each organisation, I'm sure, but maybe your carpentry example, I'm thinking, without knowing his business, data maybe has limited value to him, depending. But if he's obsessed and so everyone's telling me I've got to do this, I've got all this data, I've got to do something with it. It's understanding, as it were, what you should or shouldn't be doing with it, rather than just collecting all these meaningless, measurements that might not actually have any value to your business.
Yeah, it's so true. Like I always chuckle to myself when talking to customers initially, especially around things like reporting and business intelligence, because I always imagine, what would actually happen to this business in terms of their revenue if you just turned all of this reporting off, and a lot of the time, I think the impact would be a lot less than they think. I'm sure that on the operational level, recruitment pipelines and stuff, things would break. And then the further up the organization you go, the more fuzzy the outcomes become, and the more people are just using intuition, and they're not necessarily really leveraging data in a useful way. They're just using it because we're told to use data and we need to be data driven. I think that's probably a cultural issue. It's actually quite hard to build a culture where you accept data-driven decision making. You can see it right through a business from, it can manifest in operational layers, right from things like the way that products, software products or any kind of products are evolved. Is it done through just intuition, or is it done through data and testing and feedback loops, right through to the way that executives decide the market directions of companies? Is it done through a kind of mythical Steve Jobs-esque just innovation and intuition, or is it done through through data, through hard market data? And I think the bigger the company, the more value there is to be tapped there. It's one of the reasons why we see big banks investing so heavily, because they have such deep troves of data that they don't necessarily see challenger banks as too much of a risk to them, not because they're not capable of gaining market share, but because they understand the value of the data they have is so immense that it will be very difficult for challengers who don't have that depth of data to catch up with them. It's almost like a moat if you can build it and if you can really leverage it. But you're right, to smaller businesses, maybe it's more about finding efficiencies than it is about really using data to transform. I'm sure that will come, but it's probably a few years away. I think for smaller businesses, software is probably still what really drives value.
And yeah, I was going to come on and say that the strategy, this sort of change strategy, you referenced culture there. So the culture is important. Is it as important as the tools that you then, the technology tools you then decide to deploy, or is the technology the sort of driving force and the culture follows after? What's the sort of balance between the two, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think being able to actually adapt to change, to transform, and to adopt the processes which will actually support those new capabilities is the most important thing. And that's really very much dictated by a company's culture. All the strategy in the world will never overcome that. It will just sit on paper in the hands of a few hamstrung individuals. It's that sort of the fear people have of consultancy, that the consultants will come in and they will tell you what to do, and it will all look fantastic on paper, and then 3 or 4 years down the line, none of it will have really manifested. That is driven by a company's culture, and no amount of brilliant technology can overcome that if you can't turn the business and get it to adopt those new technical strategies. Microsoft is actually a fantastic example. Microsoft are a business who risen to the top of their game, dropped away, and risen back and dropped away many times over the last few years. And what Microsoft do brilliantly is have a culture where they can rapidly adopt to change. Yeah, they have great technology, they're Microsoft, but ultimately that wouldn't mean much if they couldn't quickly pivot and catch up and learn from their mistakes and move from being a business which only a few years ago was heavily focused on enterprise support models to today being one of the big cloud competitors. That takes a really, really focused culture. The technology alone will just not do it for you.
And in terms of that landscape, are you an optimist or pessimist by nature? I mean, are you depressed that so many companies still haven't got round the fact that if they don't do something, they might potentially, not be in business in a year or so's time? But they cling on to their existing stuff, or do you think most companies do get the idea they've got to move forward and it's helping them on that journey?
Definitely an optimist. I think it depends on the timelines you look at. Like, we've been through so many massive shifts in the way the world works. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it wasn't that long ago that sort of 98% of everyone alive was involved in farming. And it was a very short amount of time after, mechanization and industrial revolution, and that figure drops. It's like 1 or 2% now, or even less. You see the same thing through things like the rise of industrialization in countries and then that falling away as they move into service industries. To me, this kind of shift is similar. I'm sure 30, 40 years from now, a lot of the job description and a lot of the companies and the way we approach things will be completely different. And as a result, a lot of those businesses, they will go bust. But I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. I think that's just the pace of change in the world. And as long as there are new opportunities being created at the same rate, it's just about adapting, really. So yeah, I'm a massive optimist. I think there's a huge amount of upside because all of those things I described, although they might have been painful in the process of going through them, I don't think anyone would want to go back to a time when you have to, grow your own food or starve if there's a bad winter, or, your house is freezing cold because you don't have good heating, or hell, give up your smartphone, which, people are suddenly, they have their whole life tied into their phones. I think people wouldn't necessarily want to go back, even though you could say that in all those things happening created a huge amount of turmoil and pain in businesses that failed along the way.
And just related to this sort of transformation idea, sustainability has been around for a long time, and paid maybe lip service, you could argue, up until fairly recently. It's now sort of front and center on most people's agenda. Do you think that is going to have again, to the companies you deal with, clearly, money, profit, all that kind of stuff is important, but is there sustainability? I mean, can you foresee a time when, at the moment, say, people deal with companies because of that customer interface is, got to be absolutely as slick as possible, but there will be a time when maybe the environmental sustainability sort of credentials of companies will be as important to consumers?
Yeah, I think consumers there's consumer trends. You can say consumers, they shift their focus of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable over the years. I think there's always a constant thread that consumers are driven by value and experience. They're always the primary drivers, and things like sustainability are usually secondary concerns. So I do think sustainability will grow in importance massively. I think the driver will probably be economic more than the consumer. So I think it will be pushed largely by government, by consumer needs, through things like the impact that it will have on price. I think models whereby you ship products many times around the world, for example, the economics of that may start to shift as you see things like the cost of fuel going up. So the cost of those things becoming prohibitive. So you start to see supply chains needing to start shrinking. I don't know if that will happen, but that's an example of how I think businesses will be pushed into being more sustainable. And consumer preference will start to shift that way more and more. I think it will be a slow journey, if I'm honest. Like there's a lot of good initiatives going on. Technology is a mixed blessing. You have things like Bitcoin, which are just horrendously bad for the environment in many respects. But then you have things like what we're doing now, video conferencing, where we're using a tiny fraction of a server, using a small amount of energy instead of potentially commuting, a couple of 100 miles. So give and take. I'm generally optimistic about that. But I think it's going to be a long journey, and technology is not the silver bullet.
And maybe just as we sort of wrap things up, for companies, as I say, I'm sure most companies are aware of the pressures on their business, and plenty will have started trying to address those. But what sort of couple of bits of advice would you give to companies, in the early stages, or maybe even, they've tried it and for whatever reason they've been underwhelmed by the success, just a couple of pointers as to where to start this process, if that's possible.
Yeah. My biggest piece of advice always is just forget about technology. There's way too many buzzwords: artificial intelligence, machine learning, data lakes, whatever. None of those things will intrinsically make your business more effective any more than buying 10 new printers for your office. If your employees were queuing up day and night for printers, maybe that would be a reasonable investment. But the better question to ask is, why are we printing so much? Not what's the best printer for us to buy. And that's often what you see when you initiate these conversations. It's a starting position of, I need more printers, or, I need to use AI to solve problem X. The vast majority of the time, they're trying to fix a broken process with a magic bullet. And the solution is usually to entirely remove or replace the process that's creating problem X. And that's usually with something far more mundane than AI. It's normally a much more straightforward solution. So I think when you start thinking with technology and how can technology solve my problems, you often get taken off down blind alleyways. And that is by far the hardest thing with even with modernization. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about modernization or transformation. It's technology is so vast and unwieldy that no one really understands all the facets of it. You can have a room full of consultants and there'll still be 10 blind spots. It's inevitable. So you're always better off really trying to understand exactly the problem and capability that you're trying to address, and just coming up with a really the simpler that the solution sounds and the more understandable it is to the average person, normally the more success you'll find in finding a good route to implementing it. That route may end up being something involving a lot of technology and a lot of complexities, but at least you've started from the right point. You've not started by saying, I want to find out what I can do with artificial intelligence, which is probably going to be spend quite a bit of money and find some interesting things out and not much more.
And I'm guessing from what you said as well that it's fairly important that somebody in a senior position, someone, I know, dare I say, an ordinary employee comes along and says, we need to do this or that. They may not get that much traction. So, but it needs almost a board level person to say, look, we need to do something, and I'm going to lead a project. And then there needs to be buy-in to that, as opposed to, as I say, little pockets that maybe don't go that far.
Yeah, I think pockets are fine. It's a realistic way that companies operate. You're always going to have people who want to fix problems inside departments. Nobody wants to use an old, outdated system, when they know there's something new and better. I think that's fine. I think the risk is when a business operates like that and they tell themselves they're digitally transforming. That's not digital transformation. I think if you are doing that, you have to be realistic that that's tactical, small tactical wins, from the ground up, which are important. But there has to be an understanding of almost constant investment in technology now in businesses. I think it's at odds partially with the way businesses, especially more traditional businesses, do accounting cycles. They tend to think about things in terms of, we'll buy this system and we'll depreciate it over 5 years and then we'll replace it. And, that's how Microsoft became the super powerful company they are, by playing into that game. But that model just isn't relevant anymore. In 5 years and you'll be bankrupt. That's an eternity in technology terms these days. If Facebook was still doing what they were doing 5 years ago, they'd have dropped off the radar by now. It's the speed of change is huge. So yeah, you have to have that strategy coming down from the top level, which is really understood as a constant investment in change, because it will ultimately drive return. It will make you a stronger, better company.
Okay, well, it's been lovely to chat to you. So, Alex, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve.